Hello there, it's Jo from Minerva. Today I'm doing a quick sewing tutorial on how to prepare your fabric before you cut it. It's sometimes tempting to rip open your parcel, lay your fabric on the table, put your pattern pieces on and cut it out, but actually with a little bit more care at that beginning stage you can get a really successful and professional make. We're going to take a look at how to pre-wash your fabric, how to lay out your fabric, how to find a good fold, how to understand grain lines and any other little tips that pop up along the way. You might notice I'm working with different fabrics throughout this tutorial. I'm wearing different clothes, I'm cutting out at different times, the light might be a little bit different, but every time I cut something out I tried to think what I could show you about preparing fabric, so they're little snippets of lots of different videos. The answer to do I always have to pre-wash my fabrics isn't always yes, but it's mostly yes. So if you're working with viscose, cotton, denim, any stretch fabrics, yes. If you're working with silk or delicate fabrics, or a fabric that you might decide that you want to have dry cleaned after you've used it. So I've made a lace dress, I didn't pre-wash my lace because I'm going to have that item dry cleaned. So however you prepare your fabric is the same as how you would expect to use it as a garment. If I'm making t-shirts for my kids or underwear for my children, then I will not only wash the jersey, but I will also tumble dry it as well, because that's what I will do with those items in my weekly washing. To completely understand the grain of fabric, it's best to take it right back to the beginning to how it came off a loom. So this fabric has a raw edge here. This is the raw cut edge. It has a selvage on each side. That's the really tightly woven edge that stops it fraying. So that is on each end of the loom. And if you imagine, the fabric is coming out of the machine like this, and this is the straight grain, so this is the lengthwise grain, and from selvage to selvage is the width grain. The lengthwise grain runs off the warp threads, and this is called the straight grain because it's really stable. So even if I try to pull that, it's a really stable grain of the fabric, and the grain, this straight grain, runs parallel to the selvage. The cross grain is the one that goes across the width. So from selvage to selvage, we do have a little bit more give. That's on the weft threads, so that's the width, and that's called the cross grain. So when you have your fabric, if we were cutting a bodice front, say example, we would fold our fabric in half and match up the selvages. We've got our print running the right way. Because we've gone selvage to selvage, our print is the same direction on the other side. We've got the length grain here, and that's not moving, and we've got the width grain, the cross grain here, which most patterns take advantage of. So on this cross grain, you commonly find that your pattern runs shoulder to hem on the length grain, and centre point to underarm across the bust on the cross grain, because then you gain that little bit of fabric ease across the back of your shoulders and across your bust. You can also get a bias grain as well. So that is when you fold your fabric 45 degrees, that's the true bias, and your fabric will work even more on a stretch. You can get a bias of any description if you fold your fabrics and cut across the weave of the fabric, but you get the most stretchy and the true bias on 45 degrees. When you get your fabric, you will want to work on grain, so you will need to find the grain line. So this grain line is easy to find because here's my selvage, and I can measure and put an arrow here to make sure that I'm running my selvage in the right direction. But if I want true on grain, then I need both of my right angles to be square. So what you would do is line up your selvage edge on a cutting mat, and then you would square off the end. So in this case, I would need to take that edge off there. I'll draw it on. I'll just do it with a marker pen so that you can see it more easily. So you can square off and true up your fabric with a grid or a cutting mat. You can use the corner of the table because that's a right angle. So if you don't have cutting mats, you can use the corner of your table or a line on your table. You could use the grain line that's on your table. You could match up against that. You could use an L-shaped ruler. There's lots of different ways to do it, but if you true up your fabric from the start, you now know that you've got a grain line from selvage to centre running this way, and now you've got a straight line running this way to this way. So we could draw a cross there, imaginary, and in each corner would be a right angle. If you want to find the true grain of your fabric on the crosswise, the width, you can make a little snip in the end, and you can tear your fabric because the fabric will only tear on the true cross grain. So you can see already it wasn't very straight because I had that. I've done it again from the other end. That's the end we just marked with a pen. And when we press that edge now, we'll have an on grain, cross grain, and we've got the selvage marking our straight edge on the length grain. Here's my right angle marked on my board, and you can see with that torn edge, I now have a right angle that's running along those grid lines and along this grid line. So now I've got my fabric perfectly square. So when I did my tear, it was really good, and then I just had a little sort of area between sort of there and there, just that little bit there where the fabric tore out. So I'm not totally sure if that bit's on grain. So another thing that I can try is to snip into the edge of the fabric on the cross grain and find a cross grain thread. When you find the cross grain thread, you won't be able to do it across the whole piece of fabric in one pull, so you'll have to do it a couple of times. But you're going to pull one thread and it will leave you a line in the fabric, a mark in the fabric, and that's because you've taken out one of the weft threads. And then you're going to cut along. That is truly the most accurate on grain cut. If you were making a long evening dress or a long maxi dress, then you might want to make sure that you've got the right drape of fabric. And then you go again. Okay, if you want to find the fold line on stretch fabrics and the grain line, that's slightly more tricky because you can't pull a thread, you can't tear it to find the grain line. You can only use your eyes to see where the grain line is. So fold your fabric, selvage to selvage, and hold it up and take a look at the fold line. And you can see on this side here, I've got a lot of drag lines, and that's because the fabric is not on grain. And if you cut it like this by just sort of smoothing it out a little bit, you would notice that when you washed it, you would get a twisted seam under your arm. You might get twisted seams on the neck, around the back of the neck, because this fabric is not on grain, and you sometimes see that in a cheap bought t-shirt. So what you need to do is to keep sort of adjusting the selvage until you get a good fold. And sometimes it's hard if the fabric's been folded for a long time and there's quite a distinct fold in the fabric. Like I've got here, this fabric's been folded for quite a long time, so it keeps wanting to go to that fold. So you might want to iron it first. But when I look on the end, matching those raw edges wouldn't have helped me because there's this much spare. It's hard to cut stretchy fabrics when they're coming off the bolt. Sometimes the manufacturing process means they haven't gone on the bolt very evenly, and of course they stretch when they could be rolled off. So for stretchy fabrics, try the fold test. Here's an example of a piece of jersey that's been cut very well because I matched the selvage edges up, and when I held it up, it is flat and on grain. It's slightly different if you've got a pattern fabric, because you could use the pattern as a bit of a guide. It's not always smack on grain, but it's sort of a good guide. So the anchors, half an anchor is just running off the fold line. This one's not got so much viscose in it, so it's not draping quite so much. But that one now is ready to lie on the table and be cut straight on grain. Most patterns are cut with the fabric folded over double, so that you're cutting out two pieces that are opposite, and you've got to watch which way you fold your fabric. So for this particular print, because it's large and it's directional, you're looking at it the right way up, then I want to fold my fabric selvage to selvage. I have a fold line here that I can use for my center fold, and I have a selvage over here which I might run to, but I might not. This is the cross grain, so I'm getting a little bit of ease there, and this is the length grain that we talked about before. That's very stable. So now if I cut out a top, you will see that the flowers will be the same way up. What you've got to be careful of is that if you have a piece of fabric and you want to use the fold lines in a particular way, say you need to get two fold lines there, that you fold it the other way, and all that you're thinking about really is getting the best area that you can. Because if all you think about is the surface area that you're going to put your pattern pieces on, then you won't be getting the best advantage from the fabric. So this time, if I put my fold line is here, so if I put my top here, then now I've got the cross grain going down my garment and I've got nothing going across. It works for some patterns, but to take advantage of the cross grain, you need to make sure that you're cutting it on the cross grain. And of course I've got my pattern going the wrong way now, and also my pattern will be going the wrong way on the other side, because sometimes if you're folding it that way, you've got one pattern going down direction, and then you'll have the other turning and going the other way. It's hard to tell on this one, but if I had umbrellas, for example, the umbrellas would be going the right way up on one way, then as it folded, then the umbrellas would be upside down on the other side. So just be careful how you fold your fabric, and you're not just trying to get the best surface area, but you're actually working with the grain of the fabric. If I put my front on the fold and then I try to put my back on the fold, I've actually ran out of fold space. So my fabric isn't long enough to do that. So we can create 2 folds. And now you can make 2 fold lines. And that way you get a fold line on this side and a fold line on the other side, so you can reduce the amount of fabric wastage that you have if you can get it folded. Now, if you need a larger size, then that you might find you can't quite fit it on. Luckily, I'm cutting the smaller size, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that and carry on putting laying the pattern pieces out. Sometimes you might be asked to cut your fabric on the bias, and you will get a different sort of shifting shape to your fabric. So you can take your fabric around curves. So you often find a neckband is asked to be cut on the bias so that you can curve it round without it going all wrinkly. And some slips and dresses and skirts are cut on the bias because they give a very fluid shape. The thing with cutting on the bias is that that fabric doesn't stop moving, so you need to cut bias fabric 24 hours after you've cut it, because you need to let the fabric relax and then hem it, and even then it might just shift around a little bit more depending on the fabric. So check that if you ask to cut on the bias that you really do. So we're going to make our fabric have a 45-degree angle. So we're going to imagine that this is a square, and we're going to fold it from corner to corner. And we're following this red flower along here, so we know we've got it on that grain. And now we get a really stretchy piece of fabric, and that's what we need to go around the neckband. So my 2 pieces, and they're cut on the bias, and you can see how much give now the fabric has. If you join 2 pieces together, you've got to join on the bias as well. So you'll be sewing that corner to corner so that when you fold it, that stretch continues. So here's how you can find the grain line. I'll show you on quite a small scale. So this is the selvage edge. I've just trimmed away any excess so that you can see the selvage. I'm going to put 18 centimetres on there and mark it. 18 centimetres on there and mark it. So I wouldn't normally put this on my fabric on the right side, but I'm just doing it to show you. So I have a line now that's showing the grain line. My fabric is folded evenly here. I've not got any twists. This is cut straight. I used the board to cut it. So that's my grain line. So if I've got an unusual pattern piece like this is a ruffle piece, then the grain line is here. So I can either put it with this grain line parallel to this line or this line, or if it fits better on my piece this way, I can put this one parallel to this one. So just so that you can see, I'm going to put my grain line marking along that line that I drew. It's important with pieces like a ruffle, because the way that this fabric is cut will mean that it curls and drapes and moves, and if you don't cut it on the grain line specified, then it won't fall the same. It will be slightly twisted. It won't cut across the grain of the fabric and have a fluid movement. So now I can cut out that ruffle, and my grain line is parallel to my selvage edge. Hope that's given you a few tips today. I know it's ranged from very simple things to some skills that you might use if you're an intermediate, but hopefully you can take something away today that helps you prepare your fabrics before you sew. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.